So just want to give an update on my thoughts on the situation in Hong Kong, which still remains tense. The protests are ongoing and it looks like neither side is backing down still, which is unfortunate. I want to talk a bit about the media aspect, but before I do that, just my stance in terms of my sympathies in the protests. I still remain 100% behind the principles of the protesters. That is, the protesters who are angry about the Communist Party's influence in Hong Kong. And I still believe that the Communist Party has brought this on themselves by their arrogance, by their bullying behaviour, and by basically lying to the people of Hong Kong. So the anger is entirely understandable. However, in recent days I have become more and more concerned about how polarising the protests are and the particular tactics. There was a high-level meeting between some student representatives and some legislators in Hong Kong, which was televised. It was widely broadcast, and there didn't seem to be any positive outcome from that. Neither side's going to back down. CY Leung is saying that there's almost no chance of Beijing conceding to any of the student demands. The student leaders aren't backing down. In fact, they've even threatened to expand the protests. I want to say that I think that expanding the protests might backfire. This might come as a surprise to people who've watched my videos on the subject. I still am with the protesters in terms of the moral side of the argument, but I'm concerned that they're going to lose a lot of support if they don't start to see that this is actually polarising people in Hong Kong. And it isn't fair to say that everyone who doesn't agree with their tactics is a CCP stooge. Some of them are, and definitely the Communist Party has used that technique before, of paying people to go in and cause trouble. That has happened before, but it's not fair to say that everyone who doesn't like the protests is a CCP stooge. I believe there probably are a lot of Hong Kongers who are getting a bit fed up with this. It probably is impacting their business, whether it be taxi drivers or presumably people trying to get their children to school or going to their place of work. One man actually said that, I believe it was in Al Jazeera, he said the actual backbone of democracy is the rule of law, so in his view the protesters were actually against democracy in terms of what they're doing. I have to say, at this stage, the protest leaders need to start acting responsibly, and definitely expanding this will not help the situation. It certainly won't make CY Leung back down. It won't make the CCP back down, and all it's going to do is alienate Hong Kongers. This thing's been going on for a month. I understand the anger behind it, but the problem is, if you sort of hold Hong Kong to ransom in the sense that you don't allow people to get to work, and I'm making this actually to anyone who might be involved in the protests, I completely sympathise with your goals, but if you really disrupt Hong Kong to an extent that people can't get to work and you're affecting their everyday business, all that's going to do is turn them against you, even if you're not being violent. And I don't think the protesters are being violent. Nevertheless, their approach is alienating. And all that's going to do is turn the wider Hong Kong population against you and in favour of the chief executive. Not necessarily in favour of Beijing, but it is certainly not going to help you to reach your goals. There is no ideal solution, but definitely expanding this is not going to win any favours. And it is also going to make it harder for countries around the world, democracies, to support your movement, because then the CCP is only going to say, oh look, this is evidence that Western countries want to cause unrest in China. So I don't think that expanding the protests is a good idea. I think what should happen is, at the very least, the protesters need to behave responsibly and allow Hong Kongers to go about their day-to-day business. This is going to affect the economy of Hong Kong, and that's very unfortunate. I'm not blaming the protesters for that. Again, I think that this situation has been brought about by the CCP. However, the protesters need to be aware and accept that they also have responsibility here. And all they're going to do is alienate Hong Kong. So I'm a bit concerned about that. Also, if it's true that, for example, I've heard that there are anti-Occupy protesters who have been waving Chinese flags, and they have been people have been surrounding them and taking the flags off them and so on. If that is true, it's wrong. If that is the case, then you're behaving no better than Chinese nationalists abroad. And if you're trying to win hearts and minds, then you need to allow them to have their view as well. Yes, I know on the mainland you wouldn't be allowed a view. Yes, that's disgraceful. But all the Chinese state media is going to do is just turn around and make you out to be the bad guys, when I actually don't think you are. So allow your opponents to have their say as well, because otherwise you're going to get bad publicity, and that is the last thing that you need. Now, I mentioned media, I want to get onto that subject. I think there is bias on both sides. Unquestionably, Western media, and I'm using that as an abstract sort of term, but let's say BBC, CNN, so on, have a pro-protester stance. That's unquestionable. I'm not going to lie about that. It's true. Unquestionably, Chinese state media like CCTV and Xinhua have a pro-Beijing stance. However, I've been watching both sides from the beginning, and I have to say the bias is more on the pro-Beijing side. Now, I know people are going to say, oh, well, you would say that, but the reason I come to that conclusion is because at least the BBC has interviewed both sides. Now, I can honestly, hand on heart, say that the BBC has interviewed taxi drivers, for example, who are angry about the protesters. They have interviewed pro-Beijing people. I've just been in a debate actually with someone from Xinhua, because I confronted them about their bias on their Facebook group, which is ironic. They have a Facebook group, but basically someone from Xinhua responded and said that the Western media downplay the pro-Beijing side. That might be true, but at least they show the pro-Beijing side. Now, honestly, if you look at Xinhua and look at CCTV, they have not shown a single person who has come out with a anti-Beijing statement. Everyone they interview is pro-Beijing, or at least anti-protester. So, yes, there is bias on both sides. This is one of those issues that is polarizing, but I still think Chinese state media has virtually no objectivity, because they won't show the other side. Why? Because it's broadcast in mainland China, and maybe they know that then mainland Chinese will see that there are actually big grievances against the Communist Party. With Western media, there isn't actually anything at stake, because it doesn't really make a difference if Western media shows pro-Beijing opinions, because it doesn't really affect people in the West, in the sense that if they show pro-Beijing opinions, there isn't going to be some sort of uprising against the British government, or the American government, or the Canadian government. But if Chinese state media show the other side, then they know full well that some mainlanders might get angry and think, well, wait a second, Hong Kongers can protest, why can we not protest? So, I've heard people say that or groups like Facebook is banned in China for security reasons, because the American government's trying to get Chinese state secrets and this sort of thing. But I think the real reason is because the Chinese censors don't want people to see alternative views, and something like Facebook has a lot of anti-CCP groups online. The counter to that is always, oh, well, look at China, we have groups like Baidu, Weibo, and lots of different groups, but the point is they're all basically approved by the CCP. No website can go through Chinese censors without being approved. It's impossible, unless people have a VPN. But I would say, well, why do you need a VPN in the first place? If Chinese media is objective, if it's not controlled by the Communist Party, then why do you need a VPN? What do they have to fear? And you can't really make a comparison to the situation in the West, because I can freely look at Baidu, I can freely look at Weibo, I can freely look at those Chinese websites. Whereas Chinese people, the only way they could see, for example, YouTube, Twitter and Facebook, is either by getting a VPN or by being resident in a Western country. So it's not a fair situation at all. And it is unfortunate. Now, this person from Xinhua sort of downplayed that, and they said, oh, well, it was just some disagreement with the authority, and they were being pretty vague on this. But eventually it will be allowed, or something like that. I hope it is, but, you know, there's big issues here. So in conclusion, although I support the Hong Kong protesters in spirit, I don't agree with some of the methods they're using, because I think it will damage Hong Kong in the long run. They've made their point. I think now is the time to dismantle. Maybe it's got people talking, maybe it's got people debating, but whilst I think they're very brave, I also think that they're being a little bit reckless at this point. And other Hong Kongers are going to, I'm not going to call them this, but I think other Hong Kongers will accuse them of being selfish. I don't think they are, actually. I think they have noble initiatives, but they also need to be responsible and realise that this is really dividing Hong Kong. And foreign investors are going to be reluctant to put money into Hong Kong as long as this is going on. I also believe that yes, both sides are biased. Okay, I'm saying that now. Yes, Western media is biased as well. I know they are. So I'm not going to say they're completely neutral on the issue. But I do contend that I have seen Western sources interview both sides, and they should interview both sides. They should show pro-Beijing views as well. Just for the record, 6 years ago when the very controversial Beijing torch relay protests were going on, there was a lot of these complaints about biased Western media. What did the BBC do? They invited on Chinese students in London to have their say. Now, if Westerners had a problem with Chinese state media, do you really think that Westerners in China would be invited on to Xinhua to have their view? No, they wouldn't. So really it's not comparable in that sense. I, as a Westerner, would never be invited on to Xinhua to complain about their bias. Of course not. Why would they give me a platform? But I feel that the West overall is a lot more tolerant. Doesn't mean we're perfect, of course not. And the BBC, believe me, is very far from perfect. I can think of many ways to criticise the BBC. But sadly, when it comes to these protests, Chinese media is just doing what it's expected, what I would expect it to do, which is showing entirely pro-Beijing views. That, I'm afraid, is just a fact.